I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. You've heard the saying, "What does not kill me will make me stronger." Do you agree with that saying? This is something that I have embraced as I've gone through life in many ways. Certainly true as an athlete, the no pain, no gain principle. In fact, when you're on your indoor trainer as a cyclist, this is often referred to as the pain cave. But this has limits as well. After all, you can be overtrained. Too much pain and you reach the point of diminishing returns. And so it was with my broken foot. I determined during my retreat that I would be able to be off the crutches and on my boot by the end. But pushing through pain does not really work very well to heal a broken bone. So I had to really wait on God for that. And in fact, when we were discussing this in the sacristy last week, someone said, "Yeah, what does not kill you only kills you more slowly." Now, this saying is popular parlance in our culture, but it comes from a very serious principle put forth by Nietzsche. And somebody asked me very seriously several weeks ago, now that's true for Christians too, is it not? What does not kill you makes you stronger. Is it true? Is this something that you embrace as a Christian for the building up of character? Because that's, of course, more what Nietzsche meant. Well, let's consider what St. Paul might say about this in light of our epistle reading today. He says, "I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and want." So he says he's learned how to do these things, and that comes from experience, and that comes from being abased quite a bit, from his fair share of pain. We see this in the book of Acts, and he recounts it writing to the Corinthians, how he experienced shipwrecks, beatings, even stoned to the point that his persecutors thought he was dead, left him out for dead, and imprisonments. And here, writing to the Philippians, he's writing from a jail in Ephesus. So to some extent, we can say, yes, taking a page out of St. Paul's life, it's true. What does not kill us makes us stronger. But if we go further, we see another element here, which certainly departs from what Nietzsche had in mind. He says, "I can do all things in him who strengthens me." So this is not just his own strength that he's drawing on. He has something that certainly Nietzsche couldn't have confessed, that he has strength outside of himself, supernatural strength through the living God. And it's when he encounters his weakness, that's when he receives Christ's strength. So it's true, now we might really be able to ask, without Christ, can we really say that what does not kill us makes us stronger? Because this gets pushed to its breaking point sooner often than we imagine. For trauma often is simply just that, left as trauma, very difficult to heal. Or when you have too many disappointments, what happens with your life? Often we become cynical, or we lose the hope that we used to have. And certainly it's from this perspective in many ways in which a nihilist like Nietzsche was writing. But Paul says that he learned to be content no matter what the circumstances. In fact, in the letter, which is not included in our lectionary reading today, that's how he begins. He says, "I have learned in whatever circumstances to be content." This is what the Puritan Jeremiah Burroughs called the rare jewel of Christian contentment, which is only possible when we learn to be strong in the strength of our Lord. So how does this happen? How do we develop this contentment? Do you have that contentment? Are you content whether things are going well or whether you're in want? The context of our epistle reading today is that Paul had just received a gift from the church, from the Philippians. They had sent some provision for him in jail. Back then, you didn't have state-sponsored penitentiary with cafeterias providing food for the prisoners. Typically, prisoners relied on others to give them their needs, and he was just supplied by them. And so he's telling them essentially, your gift was a grace to me as if it were a daffodil on a cold, gray March day. But he also is telling them that even if I didn't receive this gift, I still would have been content. Because he has learned, he says, already how to be abased and how to abound. In all things, he's learned he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. Now, we know, of course, that it's hard to be content when we're abased. But how about when we abound? Is that so hard? That's not so much trouble, right? Or is it? A few weeks ago, we were around the dinner table, and one of my daughters pointed out that she had read a book that it showed some statistics that poverty in the world is largely going away. Often in the media, it's emphasized that the book will point out, cited examples to say the media will often make it look like poverty is getting worse. But the abundance of provision is going throughout even the two-thirds nations, so to speak. But the thought came to me, does that really necessarily make them better off? Because surveys have shown that what countries have the most contented people? The poorest countries in the world. They're the ones who are the most content. What's going on here? Well, we find that oftentimes when we abound, we lose sight of the deeper sources of our contentment. F. Scott Fitzgerald, writing after the advent of the Great Depression, he had lost a lot in the Great Depression, in the stock market crash. But then in a largely autobiographical, fictional piece, he wrote, referring to himself, I already lost everything I wanted in the boom. So often when we abound is something that we need to learn to be able to thrive in. Why is this? Because so often for us, when you and I abound, we tend to lose sight of the source, the true source of our joy and contentment. And why? Because when we abound, there are so many opportunities for pleasure and exploration that occupy the mind. And eventually, diversions can become an end in themselves to distract us from that rare jewel of Christian contentment, the true source of our joy. In our first reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, he refers to a feasting that will happen. But ultimately what he's pointing to is that ultimate feasting that will be at the end of time. This is what our earthly feasting should point us to, but sometimes we lose sight of that. We're just contented in a very earthly sense with what we have, and we lose that deeper joy. And so it can be a grace at times when God gives us times of abasement so that we hold on to what cannot be taken away. I like the way Father Maximus describes this. Actually, Father Maximus is a pseudonym. This is the book, The Mountain of Silence. And his real name is Athanasios, a monk who's now a bishop. And he writes about this very principle. He says, there's tests that happen. Really, true tests when we abound as well as when we're abased. Poverty, prosperity, happiness, unhappiness, health, illness, success, failure. Any such conditions that we may face can become temptations. I can see temptation in poverty, illness, unhappiness, failure. But it is hard to see it in happiness, prosperity, and success. And he continues, the elders instruct that wealth and worldly success can only become great temptations if they imprison your heart and mind to this world, or make you arrogant and vain. And so it is, he uses the word temptation But the word that's translated temptation in the scriptures in the Greek is the same word translated as trial. So, pyrosmos can mean either, and really is often one and the same. In a trial, we're tempted to lose hope, or when we would, the trials of abundance, we're tempted to lose sight of our true hope. But writing to the Corinthians, St. Paul says, there is no temptation such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with each temptation make a way to escape, so that ye may be able to bear it. That's 1 Corinthians 10, starting with verse 13. And so these temptations he uses to help us to grow. And we don't celebrate these trials as if there's something we look for. I want to turn to Athanasius once more, for he says, when I say sorrow, it does not mean that we celebrate suffering as if it is something to cherish and pursue. Rather, to the extent that suffering is unavoidable, accept it as a gift from heaven. Then it will have a therapeutic effect on your heart. Redefine it in your mind as an opportunity for spiritual growth, because that's what it is in reality. But the question is, will you receive this work that God wants to do in your heart in those times of being abased, so that you will see God more clearly when you abound? That brings us to our gospel passage today, where you have the wedding feast. And those who were used to the abundance of the Master didn't want to come. They didn't see the value of this wedding feast that Isaiah looked forward to, which ultimately refers to the feast of the Eucharist, pointing to our feast of the wedding supper of the Lamb in the New Jerusalem. And so I went out to the thoroughfares, to the byways, to get all these people who aren't used to this abundance. And they came and they could appreciate it more. But there was one, though, who didn't learn from his trials, didn't learn from his lack, and wasn't prepared for that wedding feast. God forbid that speak of you or me. But let it be axiomatic that, yes, that our trials can be blessings, so that we see God more thoroughly in the blessings, pointing as a foretaste to that heavenly wedding feast, because we've already tasted of that foretaste of our God in the cross as well. The goal here is what the Carmelite theologians would so often refer to as detachment, being detached from the things of the world. And once more, I want to turn to Athanasius, who, let me just step back for a second here. St. Paul, do we relate to him? I mean, look, of course, he grew from his trials. He's the giant of the faith. Or what about monk Athanasius, who's committed himself to a life of asceticism? But his point is that all people, certainly lay people, must develop a sense of inner freedom from external possessions, positions, and feelings of self-importance. They're asked to use the objects of this world, certainly, but not to become emotionally attached and enslaved by them. Ordinary people living in the world can also engage in ascesis, or that holy struggle for when it is practiced. Whatever event comes along must be seen as a temptation that can be exploited spiritually for the attainment of humility, the real and only pathway to God. And so this is what we're after, being able to see God in all things so that we can enjoy him in all things and represent him in the world as a foretaste of heaven. So let's return to that initial question. What does not kill you? Does it make you stronger? Well, yes and no. If we receive Christ who died and rose again, he works this dynamic in your soul as well. We receive this in the Eucharist. And so we have a First Communion today. Someone will experience this dynamic for the first time. And then in a baptism today, where we'll look at what it means at the very same time. We are baptized into the death and resurrection of Christ. And so this pattern repeats throughout our lives, like one foot in front of the other, being abased and abounding, abased and abound, so that we can see Christ in all things. And we experience this ultimately so that we can sing with Katharina von Schlegel. And I'm going to conclude with these words of her hymn. Be still, my soul. The Lord is on your side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to your God to order or provide. In every change, he faithful will remain. Be still, my soul. Your best, your heavenly friend, through thorny ways leads to a joyful end.